Honorable the Vice President.
Let us pray. Almighty God, we willingly acknowledge you as the Supreme Being, most gracious and most merciful. Look down, we beseech you, on us who are members of this Senate, and deign to assist us in the duties that we have to perform on behalf of our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Open our eyes to see the truth and help us to accept it with all its implications into our lives. Direct us, O Lord, in our deliberations so that setting aside private interests, unwholesome prejudices, and personal affections, we may treat all matters set before us with honesty, courage, and conviction. Through all we say and do in this Senate, may we give glory and honor to your holy name, inspire confidence in our fellow citizens, and make a positive contribution to the peace and prosperity of our nation. Amen.
Oath or affirmation, announcements by the Vice President.
Honorable Senators, I wish to advise that the President of the Senate, Senator the Honorable Christine Kangaloo, is currently acting as President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Honorable Senators, I have granted leave of absence to Senator the Honorable Dennis Moses, Senator Foster Cummings, and Senator Dr. Maria Dillon Remy, all of whom are out of the country. Honorable Senators, I have received the following correspondence from Her Excellency the President, Paula May Weeks, ORTT, and Her Excellency the Acting President, Christine Kangaloo. The Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, by Her Excellency Christine Kangaloo, Acting President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, to Mr. Ndali Young. Whereas the President of the Senate has temporarily vacated her office of Senator to act as President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, now therefore I, Christine Kangaloo, Acting President as aforesaid, acting in accordance with the advice of the Prime Minister, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44 of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Ndali Young, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 12th of March 2019 and continuing during the acting appointment of Senator the Honorable Christine Kangaloo as President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President St. Anne's this 11th day of March 2019. To Mr. Augustus Thomas, whereas Senator the Honorable Dennis Moses is incapable of performing his duties as a senator by reason of his absence from Trinidad and Tobago, now therefore I, Christine Kangaloo, Acting President as aforesaid, acting in accordance with the advice of the Acting Prime Minister in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(a) and Section 44(4)(a) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Augustus Thomas, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 12th of March 2019 and continuing during the absence from Trinidad and Tobago of the said Senator, the Honorable Dennis Moses, given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President St. Anne's this 11th day of March 2019. To Mr. Wayne A.M. Innes, whereas Senator Foster Cummings is incapable of performing his duties as a senator by reason of his absence from Trinidad and Tobago, now therefore I, Christine Kangaloo, Acting President as aforesaid, acting in accordance with the advice of the Acting Prime Minister, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(a) and Section 44(4)(a) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Wayne A.M. Innes, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 12th of March 2019 and continuing during the absence from Trinidad and Tobago of the said Senator Foster Cummings, given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President St. Anne's this 12th day of March 2019. to Ms. Siobhan Eiffel. Whereas Senator Dr. Maria Dillon Remy is incapable of performing her duties as a senator by reason of her absence from Trinidad and Tobago, now therefore I, Paula May Weeks, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(a) and Section 44(4)(c) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Ms. Siobhan Eiffel, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 5th of March 2019 and continuing during the absence from Trinidad and Tobago of the said Senator Dr. Maria Dillon Remy, given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the Office of the President, St. Anne's, this 26th day of February 2019. Honorable Senators, members are required to take the oath.
I, Andala Young, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do solemnly affirm that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago and will uphold the Constitution and the law and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities of the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
I, Augustus Thomas, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, upon which I am about to enter.
I, Wade Innes, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago and will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
I, Siobhan Eiffel, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear truth, faith, and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
Bills brought from the House of Representatives on the supplemental order paper, the Companies Amendment Bill 2018 in the name of the Attorney General. Papers.
Leader of Government Business.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper in the name of the Minister of Rural Development and Local Government. The ministerial response of the Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government to the 12th report of the Public Administration and Appropriation Committee, 3rd session 2017-2018, 11th Parliament on an examination into the administration of disaster relief in Trinidad and Tobago. The ministerial response of the Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government to the 19th report of the Public Accounts Committee, 4th session 2018-2019, 11th Parliament on the examination of the audited financial statements of the Chaguanas Borough Corporation for the financial year 2008 to 2011. The annual administrative report of the Arima Borough Corporation for the period 2016-2017.
Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper in my name. The ministerial response of the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries to the 12th report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, 3rd session 2017-2018, 11th Parliament on an examination of disaster relief in Trinidad and Tobago. And secondly, the ministerial response of the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries to the second report of the Joint Select Committee on Foreign Affairs, 4th session 2018-2019, 11th Parliament on an inquiry into regional integration and the strengthening of the CARICOM institution. I thank you.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper and the supplemental order paper in the name of the Minister of Finance. The reports of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago with respect to the progress of the proposals to restructure CLICO, British American, CIB, and CIB for the quarter ended September 30, 2018 and December 31st, 2018. The audited financial statements of the National Infrastructure Development Company Limited, NIDCO, for the financial year ended September 30, 2016 and September 30, 2017. The audited financial statements excuse me, of the Sports Company of Trinidad and Tobago for the financial year ended September 30, 2018. The audited financial statements of the Tourism Trinidad Destination Management Company Limited for the financial year ended September 30, 2018. The ministerial response of the Minister of Finance to the 21st report of the Public Accounts Committee, 4th session, 2018-2019, 11th Parliament on the examination of the audited financial statements of the Chaguanas Development Authority for the financial years 2008 to 2014, and the reports of the Auditor General of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on the financial statements of the Princestown Regional Corporation Chairman's Fund for the years ended September 30, 2016 and September 30, 2017. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Leader of Government Business.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. So, Vice President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper and the supplemental order paper in the names of the Minister of Education, the Minister of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, the Vice President, the Minister of National Security, the Minister of Planning and Development, and the Minister of Health. The ministerial response of the Ministry of Education to the 15th report of the Public Accounts Enterprises Committee, 3rd session 2017-2018, 11th Parliament on an examination of the audited accounts, balance sheets, and other financial statements of the Youth Training and Employment Partnership Program for the financial year 2008 to 2014. The ministerial response of the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs to the second report of the Joint Select Committee on Foreign Affairs, 4th session 2018-2019, 11th Parliament on an inquiry into the regional integration and strengthening of the CARICOM institution. The response of the Service Commission Department to the 19th report of the Public Accounts Committee, 4th session 2018-2019, 11th Parliament on the examination of the audited financial statements of the Chaguanas Borough Corporation for the financial year 2008 to 2011. The ministerial response of the Ministry of National Security to the 12th report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, 3rd session, 2017-2018, 11 Parliament, on an examination into the administration of disaster relief in Trinidad and Tobago. The response of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service to the 16th report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, 3rd session, 2017-2018, 11 Parliament, on an examination into the implementation of the Public Sector Investment Program. The ministerial response of the Ministry of Planning and Development to the 21st report of the Public Accounts Committee, 4th session, 2018-2019, 11 Parliament, on the examination of the audited financial statements of the Chaguanas Development Authority, the CDA, for the financial year 2008 to 2014. And finally, Mr. Vice President, the ministerial response of the Ministry of Health to the 16th report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, 3rd session, 2017-2018, 11 Parliament, on the examination into the implementation of the Public Sector Investment Program.
Senator the Honorable Alison West.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to lay on the table.
Senator, 1 second. The clerk has to actually announce
What's
the...
from committees?
Now, Senator the Honorable Alison West.
Thank you again, sir. Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following report as listed on the supplemental order paper in my name. The interim report of the Joint Select Committee, 4th session, 2018-2019, 11th Parliament, established to consider and report on the Trinidad and Tobago Revenue Authority Bill 2018. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
John, questions?
Senator Mark.
Thank you. To the Honourable Minister of Health, in light of reports that a shortage of dialysis machines at the Scarborough General Hospital is significantly compromising the health care provided to patients at that institution, can the Minister state what is being done to address this matter?
Minister of Health.
Thank you very much. Mr. Vice President, I take this opportunity to correct the erroneous media reports which reasonably would have led Senator Mark to ask this question. It's a reasonable question based on erroneous media reports. The Scarborough General Hospital is not the dialysis center in Tobago. It is the Scarborough Health Center. That center has 11 dialysis chairs, which operate Monday to Saturday between the hours of 6 to 9 p.m. And I am told by the Chief of Staff that there is absolutely no compromising of healthcare in Tobago because everyone who needs dialysis is being accommodated at the Scarborough Health Center, which is a major dialysis center in Tobago. The hospital has one machine for emergency or special uses. So I am glad for the opportunity, and Senator Mark asked a reasonable question, but it was based on erroneous reporting. I thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Mark, supplemental.
Yeah. Could the Honourable Minister indicate whether there is some element of confusion in Tobago as it relates to where people in Tobago are to go to receive dialysis treatment, health versus the Scarborough Hospital?
Minister of Health.
Mr. Vice President, I myself paid a visit to that facility early in 2016. And I could tell you from my understanding, there is no confusion. Citizens who live in Tobago know exactly where to access dialysis. I could tell you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I was shocked when I paid a visit there to see a 17-year-old young male being dialyzed who had end-stage renal disease, 17 years old, looking like me. And you cannot look at a person and make a prognosis and tell them what their health status is. 17-year-old male, looking like me, not overweight, on dialysis for end-stage renal disease. That is the type of conversation we need to have in this country about advising people on how to take care of their health. Again, I thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Mark, second supplemental. No? Okay. Next question, Senator Mark.
To the Honourable Minister of Works and Transport, given the recent crash of a Boeing 737 MAX aircraft has caused several countries to suspend the use of this aircraft in their airspaces, can the minister state whether local aviation authorities are considering a similar course of action?
Minister of Works and Transport.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, the Trinidad and Tobago Civil Aviation Authority is mindful of the information in the public domain with respect to the recent accident involving the Ethiopian airline Boeing 737 MAX aircraft. The Trinidad and Tobago Civil Aviation Authority notes from the media report that the accident is being investigated by the relevant authorities. Consequently, the Trinidad and Tobago Civil Aviation Authority cannot be engaged in speculation about the cause of the accident and will take action once it has reason to believe that safety of flights is compromised. The authority is monitoring the events related and extends its condolences to all those who have lost friends, family, and loved ones. I thank you.
Senator Mark, supplemental.
Mr. Vice President, through you, can I ask the Honourable Minister whether he's aware of any aircraft, commercial aircraft, that operates within our airspace using this same Boeing 737?
Minister of Works and Transport.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, the answer to that is yes. We do have American Airlines, and I think is United operates these 737 in our airspace. Thank you.
Senator Mark, second supplemental.
Yeah, Mr. Vice President, in light of the decision taken by several major states to protect the safety and security of their citizens, can the Honourable Minister indicate whether it is the intention of the government of Trinidad and Tobago to seriously consider taking action against, even on a temporary basis, as it relates to those aircraft that seem at this time, Mr. Vice President, we do not know what are the reasons for what has happened, but for safety, whether the minister is prepared to give the nation of TNT and the traveling public any undertaking as it relates to those aircraft operating in our airspace.
Thank you, Senator Mark. That question has been answered already. That's relatively the original question, so it's been answered, so I won't allow that question.
Questions on notice, questions for oral answer.
Leader of Government Business.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, there are 13 questions on the order paper. We plan to answer 12. We ask for a deferral of question number 78 for 2 weeks.
Question number 78 is so deferred. Senator Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Question number 77 to the Honourable Minister of National Security.
Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I respond to this question on behalf of the government. As submitted in the response to Senate question number 147 on July 2nd, 2018, Mr. Vice President, the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago was in the process of drafting legislation to treat with the issues surrounding refugees and asylum seekers. Mr. Vice President, at present, the Ministry of National Security is in the process of finalizing the draft legislation. As such, the Ministry is not in a position to provide the time frame as to when the legislation will be introduced. I thank you.
Senator Mark, supplemental.
Mr. Vice President, in light of developments in Venezuela and the possibility of a large invasion of more Venezuelans as refugees, can the minister indicate to this Honorable Senate whether the government would take the necessary steps to speed up the drafting and the completion of the drafting of this legislation and give this House a specific time frame for its introduction?
Senator Mark, just now, Minister of Agriculture, you're asking the same question in a different way. Do you want to rephrase that as a second supplemental question? Or ask another supplemental?
Yeah, Mr. Vice President, what I'm asking the Honorable Minister is, in light of what is taking place between the two countries at this time, whether the government intends, what interim measures, Mr. Vice President, may I ask, is the government intent on introducing to address the invasion of refugees and asylum seekers from Venezuela in the absence of legislation before our Parliament to deal with it in accordance with the conventions that we have signed off on, Madam Mr. Vice President?
Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Mr. Vice President, I must admit that the supplemental is extremely distinct from the original question. And I would say this: the government does not intend to deal with refugees and asylum seekers except by way of legislation, which we are in the process of finalizing. And I'm unable to provide a time frame for the finalization of that legislation, but the government is working to finalize the legislation.
Senator Mark. Next question, Senator Mark.
Question number 79 to the Honorable Minister of Public Utilities.
Minister of Public Utilities.
Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Vice President, at the conclusion of TSTT staff rationalization exercise, a total of 691 employees exited the organization. These included a combination of 503 unionized employees and 51 non-unionized employees, and an out-of-court settlement that facilitated the resignation of 77 employees. An additional 60 employees exited the organization through the out-of-court settlement on the 15th of December 2018, which allowed their prior requests to leave the organization to be followed. The company, having concluded its staff rationalization exercise, has no current plans of any further staff rationalization.
Senator Mark, supplemental. Next question, Senator Richards.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. With respect, I'd like to invoke Standing Order 2717. I withdraw the question. Yeah.
In relation to the relevant standing order, the question is withdrawn. Move on to the next question. Is that for question number 123 as well, Senator Richards?
Yes. Okay, thank you.
So we'll move on to the next question. Senator Diona Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Question number 124 to the Minister of Planning and Development.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I'm also acting for the Minister of Planning and Development at the moment. Mr. Vice President, Cabinet at its meeting held on June 21st, 2018, agreed inter alia to the following. A, that the importation of the finished expanded polystyrene products for the food and beverage sector should be banned. To the removal for a period of 2 years in the first instance of customs duty on the importation of the alternative biodegradable products listed hereunder to the EPS products used in the food and beverage sector. Those products are bioplastics, polyactide acid, crystallized polyactide, polyhydroalkanoate, and bagasse. That the Ministry of Trade and Industry provide HS codes with respect to B above. That the Ministry of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs, in collaboration with the Ministry of Trade and Industry and the Ministry of Finance, take the necessary action to give legal effect to A to C above. E, the local manufacturers of EPS products explore the addition of safe biodegradable additives to the existing manufacturing process, with production trials to commence in the last quarter of 2019. Pursuant to this Cabinet decision, the Ministry of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs, in collaboration with the Ministry of Trade and Industry and the Ministry of Finance, have developed a legal framework to give effect to the ban, which includes determination of the necessary HS codes. Upon completion of the legislative framework, the ban on the importation of finished EPS products in the food and beverage sector will be placed in effect. It is to be noted that the Ministry of Trade and Industry has also advised that notice of the intention to introduce this measure was provided to the Council of Trade and Economic Development of the Caribbean Community in November 2018. A meeting was held on February 25, 2019, to discuss the way forward to effect the Cabinet's decision in the shortest possible time. It was agreed that the Customs and Excise Division of the Ministry of Finance would present the Ministry of Trade and Industry the finalized customs codes for the styrofoam products. Upon receipt of these codes from the Customs and Excise Division, the Ministry of Trade and Industry will provide notification to the relevant international organizations within 20 days. Regarding the alternative products, the Customs and Excise Division is in the process of determining the customs codes for these products and has requested further literature from the Ministry of Planning and Development to assist in the classification of these items. These documents are currently being compiled by the Ministry of Planning and Development for submission. It was also agreed at the meeting that upon advice of the Ministry of Trade and Industry, a prohibition order would be engaged to effect a ban on styrofoam. It was agreed that this would be communicated to the Office of the Attorney General by the Ministry of Trade and Industry. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Dionarine, any supplementals?
Thank you, Honorable Minister. Is there a timeline for the ban? What is the expected? Sorry if I missed it, but is there a timeline?
There is no specific date identified. As soon as these steps that I have outlined have been completed, we will introduce the ban. The only timeline that has been identified is the target date for current manufacturers to start producing safer products, and that is the last quarter of 2019, and they seem to be well ahead of that.
Senator Dionarine, any more supplementals? No. Next question, Senator Dionarine.
Question number 125 to Minister of Planning and Development.
The Acting Minister of Planning and Development.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. In order to determine a feasible solution for the environmentally sound management of expanded polystyrene in the food and beverage sector, the Minister of Planning and Development established a multi-stakeholder steering committee and engaged in discussions with key stakeholders to discuss the expanded polystyrene industry in Trinidad and Tobago, which, according to the subcommittee report, employs just over 400 persons, with some firms being in operation for a number of years and one particular firm existing for over 40 years. These discussions involved representatives from the local manufacturers of EPS products, that is to say, Santanas Limited, Thermoplus Limited, R&C Enterprises Limited, Packet Company Limited, Printer Pack Limited, Trinidad and Tobago Manufacturers Association, Hello Green, VF Packaging Limited, Green Scene Limited, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Trade and Industry, the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Industry and Commerce, the American Chamber of Commerce of Trinidad and Tobago, the Trinidad and Tobago Solid Waste Management Company Limited, the Environmental Management Authority, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Public Utilities. Four stakeholder meetings were held during the period March 2017 to August 2018. The styrofoam industry in Trinidad and Tobago, as I indicated above, employs just over 400 persons, and firms in the industry have invested upwards of $65 million over the period 2011 to 2016, with a total asset base of close to $30 million book value. Some firms have been in operation for a number of years. The industry generated approximately $5.6 million in revenue to the government in 2016 from taxes. Economic activity in terms of expenditure generated by just one of the manufacturers of styrofoam containers had an estimated value of $16 million in 2016 in the local economy. One of the major manufacturers has been in discussion with a manufacturer of a biodegradable resin which can be incorporated into the current manufacturing process. They are also currently in the process of doing internal reviews regarding human resources they would require in their new manufacturing process. It is anticipated that several manufacturers of EPS products will be compliant by the last quarter of 2019 once their products are biodegradable EPS, which is ahead of the directive of the Cabinet. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Dionarai, no? Senator Dionarai, next question.
Question number 126 to the Minister of Planning and Development.
Acting Minister of Planning and Development.
That's you.
Mr. Vice President, solid waste management falls under my span of control, and as such, I will answer the question. A waste characterization study undertaken by a consultant contracted by the Trinidad Solid Waste Management Company Limited in 2010 indicated that food and organic waste comprise 27% of the solid waste generated in Trinidad. SWIMCOL, in recognition of the opportunity provided for diversion of this waste from the landfill and its use in the production of composite, has initiated the process for establishing an industrial compositing facility. A public expression of interest advertisement for the establishing of a composting facility was issued but was unsuccessful. A new EOI request has been prepared and will be issued by the end of March 2019.
Senator Dionarai, any supplementals? Next question, Senator Obika.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Question number 128 to the Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries has advised the Fisheries Division of the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries that the oil spill of December 21, 2018 in the Soldado main field and southwest Soldado was estimated at no more than 5 barrels of oil. The Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries is therefore not aware of any claims for losses being made by any fisherfolk arising out of that oil spill. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Obika, any supplementals?
Yes, sir. Mr. Vice President, can I ask the Minister if he's aware that there are fishermen in Fullerton, Bonas, and Granville that are claiming damage, that they have suffered damages?
Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Mr. Vice President, to repeat, the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries is not aware of any claim for losses being made by any fisherfolk arising out of that oil spill. I thank you.
Senator Obika, second supplemental.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Vice President. Can I ask the Honourable Minister, notwithstanding no claims reaching the ministry, what steps the ministry have taken to investigate, to unearth any possible damages that fishermen would have encountered?
Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Mr. Vice President, the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries is not aware of any claim for losses being made by any fisher folk out of that particular oil spill. I thank you.
Senator Beaker, any more supplementals? Next question, Senator Beaker.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Question number 129 to the Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, no revenue has been realized by the National Gas Company for business dealings in Tanzania during the period 2015 to 2018 because there have been no agreement between the government of Tanzania, nor the State Oil Company of Tanzania, and the NGC, nor the government of Trinidad and Tobago.
Senator Beaker, any supplementals? Next question, Senator Beaker.
Question number 130 to the Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, regarding the Dragon project, discussions among representatives of the various stakeholders, including the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, the NGC, Shell, and PDVSA, have progressed well over the last 2 years, resulting in, inter alia, the execution of several documents, including the term sheet in August of 2018 between PDVSA, NGC, and Shell, outlining the key parameters for the development and the sale of gas from the Dragon field. The next and final step involved the negotiation of a fully termed gas sales agreement, which will inform the final investment decision by the parties. As is well known now, recent domestic challenges being experienced in Venezuela have adversely affected the projected pace of these discussions. However, all stakeholders are confident that given the sound technical and commercial basis which the project has been developed and the obvious benefits which will accrue to both Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago, all outstanding issues can and will be comfortably addressed.
Senator Beaker, supplemental.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Vice President. Can the government, can the minister indicate, can I ask the minister if the government can indicate how they're going to be protecting Trinidad and Tobago's interests, given his admission that the situation is dire in Venezuela?
I won't allow that question. Next supplemental question, Senator Beaker.
Can the minister advise how our interests are being looked after in Caracas, given that we don't have a head of mission there?
I won't allow that question. Next supplemental question, if you have it, Senator Beaker. Senator Ramdeen.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, to the Minister of Energy and Energy Industries, having regard to the response that the Honourable Minister has given with respect to the current situation in Venezuela, can the Minister tell the population when it is that the population can expect that the gas from this Dragon gas deal will finally arrive on the shores of Trinidad and Tobago?
Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Some time ago, I think, as I in the House of Representatives or here, I did indicate that the first gas is estimated to arrive here in the latter part of 2021. Obviously, if there are delays, that timeline will stretch along. The situation in Venezuela is very fluid. We haven't made a direct monetary investment in the deal as yet. It's just agreements are being signed. Why we feel confident is that in the long term, there's a good symbiotic relationship between Eastern Venezuela and Western Trinidad's gas infrastructure. And we are quite confident that when the dust settles, everything will come back and the deal will continue along the path that it's supposed to be in.
Fourth supplemental, Senator Ramdeen.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Minister, Mr. Vice President, through you to the Honourable Minister. Minister, having regard to the fact that in the last budget presentation, this Dragon gas deal was described as one of the game changers for this government, what steps have been put in place to cushion the economic effect on Trinidad and Tobago, having regard to the fact that gas will now be expected to be received by this country and revenue will be, that would have been generated by 2021 will now has to be pushed back? What are the steps that the government has taken to cushion the economic effect on the country, Trinidad and Tobago, as a result of these delays?
I won't allow that question. Next question, Senator Richards.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Question number 154 to the Minister of Community Development, Culture and the Arts.
Minister of Community Development, Culture and the Arts.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. With respect to question number 154, it should be noted that all allocated funds were remitted through the National Carnival Commission to the Trinbago Unified Calypsonians Organization, or TUCO, for payments related to all Calypso competitions for Carnivals 2016 and 2018. The Ministry of Community Development, Culture and the Arts, therefore, expects that if there are any outstanding payments to be brought up to date, that will be done, and we have instructed the NCC, which is the disbursing body, to monitor that situation so that it is cleared up, certainly by the end of fiscal 2019, if there are any payments outstanding.
Senator Richards, supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thank you for the response, Minister. Can the Minister please indicate if, as indicated by the Chairman of the NCC, the payments were accompanied by audited financial statements from the organization TUCO?
I won't allow that question, Senator Richards. You have another supplemental? Okay. Next question, Senator Hussain.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Question number 166 to the Minister of Health.
Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. The answer to part 1, the total number of applications that have been made to access the Children's Life Fund during the period September 30th, 2015 to January 31st, 2019 was 155. Answer to part 2, the number of applications that have been denied during the period September 30th, 2015 to January 31st, 2019 was 11. It therefore means 93% of the applications have been approved. Thank you very much.
Senator Hussain, any supplementals? Senator Hussain.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Can the Minister indicate, through you, Mr. Vice President, the reasons in which those 11 applications have been denied?
Minister of Health.
So some of the reasons are, one parent wanted to bring in a medical practitioner. That clearly is not within the ambit of the Act. Another was a request for importation of medicine available here. Again, not within the ambit of the Act. About 5 of the cases were for beta thalassemia, which the courts have recently pronounced on. I will not expand because I'm sure an appeal will be filed within the 42 days. So the main reasons were, 1, the Act does not allow for the importation of medical practitioners. It does not allow for the importation of medicines. 2 were because of poor prognosis. The Act has a clause in it that says if the prognosis for the long-term health of the child is not good, the Act will not fund it. So those were the major reasons. Mr. Vice President, I want to thank the taxpayers of this country. From September 30th, 2015 to now, the taxpayers, in approving 144 applications, so 93%, have spent collectively $36,151,284.17. The taxpayer needs to be thanked most sincerely for carrying the burden, and it's a good burden for us to carry in this country. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Senator Hussain, second supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, having regard to the Minister's answer that over 144 applications have been granted with a cost of $36 million, can the Minister then indicate whether or not it would be the government's policy to open the Couva Children's Hospital so that the children can receive treatment right here in Trinidad and Tobago?
Question, Minister of Health.
I would love to answer.
I know, but I'm not allowing the question. Next supplemental, Senator
Vice
Hussain.
President, having regard to some of the reasons being given by the Minister with respect to some deficiencies in the Act, can the Minister indicate whether or not the government has taken a decision to amend the Children's Life Fund Act so that more children can benefit from this facility that is available to them?
Mr. Vice President, I never said there were deficiencies in the Act. Please don't misinterpret my words. I said the Act does not contemplate the importation of medical doctors on the request of a patient when you have the medical doctors here. I said the Act does not contemplate the importation of medicine when the medicine is available here. I said the Act did not contemplate the treatment of beta thalassemia, which the courts have decided is not a life-threatening condition. I never said Senator Saddam Hussein, my good friend and candidate for Barataria San Juan. I never said, let me repeat, I never said the Act was deficient. The Act is not deficient. We passed this Act in a bipartisan way. The Act is fit for purpose and specifies what type of condition will qualify, which is life-saving, especially life-saving surgery. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Hussain, fourth supplemental.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President, and thank you, Minister, for the answer. But I would ask the Minister whether or not, having regard to your last answer, whether or not some sort of consideration can be given for an amendment to the Act to also expand the treatments in terms of non-life-threatening diseases, because there are a lot of families with children who cannot access medical care and funding.
That is an excellent question. And what we are now doing at the ministry, under the Office of the PMOH, Principal Medical Office of Institutions, we have now set up protocols and standard operating procedures. So any child that cannot access the CLF will now come to the Ministry of Health and we devise their healthcare protocols going forward. It has already started with a few cases of children with hypoglycemia, that is low blood sugar. So under the Ministry of Health, we are now taking those cases that do not qualify under the CLF. We have developed the standard operating procedures working with the CLF, and they come to the ministry and we do their care plan. So that is an excellent question, and I thank you for it.
Introduction of bills. The Livestock and Livestock Products Board Repeal Bill 2019 in the name of the Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries. Public business, private members' business. Motions.
Senator Richards.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I beg to move the following motion standing in my name. Whereas Section 6(2) of the Education Act, Chapter 3901, provides that the Ministry of Education should provide special schools suitable to the requirements of students with physical and learning disabilities, and whereas the Ministry has not provided students with disabilities additional learning needs and/or challenging behaviors with the requisite support networks and equal opportunities needed to achieve their full potential, and whereas the lack of adequate funding, policies, and specialist staff is reflected in the poor performance of students, be it resolved that the Senate call on the government to commit to the allocation of adequate funding, reform of the appropriate legislation, and revision of policies designed to ensure that all children with special needs are provided with equal educational opportunities to other students. And be it further resolved that the Ministry of Education immediately initiate and implement a comprehensive strategy to assist all children with disabilities, additional learning needs, and/or challenging behaviors. Mr. Vice President, let me begin by thanking Senators Mark and Minister Franklin Khan for allowing this motion to be brought up into the docket, because it was quite low down in the schedule, and I greatly appreciate their acquiescence to move it up. I'm presuming, because I didn't hear this from them. They both realized the importance of this motion as it pertains to the education of a vulnerable group in Trinidad and Tobago. So I thank Senator Mark and Minister Khan for agreeing to move this motion up. Let me also start by saying, in retrospect, I would have changed one word in the motion because it sends the wrong signal and it doesn't convey the accuracy of the situation, and that change would be in the second paragraph, and whereas the ministry has not provided students with disabilities, additional learning needs, and/or challenging behaviors with the requisite support networks and equal opportunities needed to achieve their full potential, I would, upon reflection, have liked to add adequately, and not just simply not as an absolute, because that doesn't convey the truth, because the ministry really has provided some level of support. So I apologize for that. In retrospect, that should have been adequate. Adequately, sorry. I also would like to frame this against the backdrop that it is not intended to in any way diminish the work that the minister or the ministry is currently doing for special needs groups. It is not aimed at diminishing his work or the ministry's contribution, because I don't think any minister goes into that ministry to do wrong or not to help children. It is really framed at providing suggestions to improve the situation in the interest of special needs and vulnerable groups in Trinidad and Tobago. And I also want to add that it really builds on the work of the Honourable Minister Garcia, who, if I'm to believe a newspaper report that I recently read, wants special needs to be part of his legacy, and I appreciate that and commend that, if that is accurate. And also his predecessors, including Dr. Gopi Singh, past education ministers, Dr. Gopi Singh, Mrs. Prasad Bissessa, Mrs. Hazel Manning over in Padmore, and the late Clive Panton. I do believe Dr. Emmanuel Hussein may have been an education minister during his tenure. The motion is framed in 5 general areas, Mr. Vice President. Why this is important, context. Secondly, student support services in Trinidad and Tobago as they presently stand. A brief history of the special needs movement in the US, which is really analogous to the special needs movements in the UK and other first world countries. The disparate groups advocating for change separately in the 13 or so categories, and the proposals and opportunities for change in Trinidad and Tobago. I'd also like to thank, because there are several sources through which I gleaned information for this presentation, and several groups that have been working and advocating, sometimes in silos, but also nonetheless not in any way diminishing their work. The Collaborative Child Development Program, CCDP, with Dr. David Bratt, Ms. Ivis Gibson, Dr. Natalie Dick and their team. The International Journal of Special Education, 2015 through 2016. USC, University of Southern Caribbean, Andrews University, Faculties of Social Science and Education, UWI's Faculty of Education, several groups including the Down Syndrome Family Network, Autism Society, Tutor, the NPTA, PTA, and Families in Action. Mr. Vice President, let me start from a really fundamental in my mind. Our Constitution is our supreme law, and there are several rights and freedoms protected by the Constitution. And the right to an individual to life, liberty, and security of the person, enjoyment of property, etc. But the 2 areas I want to highlight are the right to equality of treatment by public bodies, and the right of a parent or guardian to provide a school of his or her choice for the education of a child or ward. And I think I singled out those 2 because in Trinidad and Tobago, we have several types of learners. We have and the state in various incarnations have stated an expressed inclusion approach, and I'll define inclusion later on. Those 2 fundamental rights really are at the heart of my motion. The issue of equity in the education system, and equity, as we all know, is different from equality, because equity means we recognize that some learners need more support. It is not about giving the same system to everyone, because everyone has different aptitudes and capabilities and gifts and shortcomings. So the state, in its education thrust, should provide for all types of learners of varying abilities to achieve their fullest potential, and the potentials are different. It's really an issue of the fundamentality of treatment, and in my mind, a human rights issue. With that said, we have to ask ourselves, does our education system, as presently configured, provide for that? Equity, equal support, equal support to achieve full potential? And in my humble opinion, the answer is no. The Education Act has powers as conferred on the minister to be exercised as to ensure, A, in Section 3, the promotion of the education of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, and the establishment of institutions devoted to that purpose, by means of which he shall thereby contribute toward the development of the human resources, physical, mental, moral, and spiritual of the student and community. B, the establishment of a system of education designed to provide adequately, and that's an important word, for the planning and development of an educational service related to the changing needs of the community. And also in 4.2a, devise a system of education calculated as far as possible to ensure that educational and vocational abilities, aptitudes, and interests of the children find adequate expression and the opportunity for development. And these are very important provisions, in my opinion. And it goes back to the question I asked earlier on, as to if the education system, as presently configured, guarantees those provisions, those abilities to all learners. And I don't think it does. And again, I'm stating frankly, it's not because the minister doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't want to, or past ministers don't want to. I think it's because of the way the system is presently constructed, and more fundamentally so, because there are no legally binding clauses or provisions for parents or families to act and demand the quality of treatment or the provisions. And this is where a lot of my thrust in this motion will be directed. Because as I will outline later on, in a brief history of the American special needs movement, it was really founded and grounded in equal rights, starting with discrimination and moving on to equality of treatment for different types of learners. And I think that is an important notation to make. One may suggest it's an issue of limited funding. And in my opinion, again, it's not an issue of limited funding. I did some simple calculation, and budgetary allocations on education and training from 2015, 10.12 billion, 2016, 9.763 billion, 2017, 7.22 billion, 2018, 9.29 billion, and 2019, 7.392 billion. Total, $41.766 billion. And that's from 2015 to 2019. In the cycle before that, the 5 years before that, it was actually more. So if we add up the total budgetary allocation in education and training, inclusive of tertiary education, for the last 10 years in this country, or some 8.5 years in this country, we're almost getting to the $90 billion mark. And that's commendable, because the last administration and this administration have shown that education is usually receives the largest allocation, and that's commendable from a philosophical point of view for any country. So in my opinion, the question may not necessarily be that of limited or inadequate funding. The question may be the framework within which we're operating, and of course, how we're spending the money. And if every type of learner in every category is really receiving their just due in terms of allocation through a different kind of framework and mindset towards all learners being equally treated in the system. We also need to look at the issue of the inadequate legal protection for children at risk of vulnerable groups. And I'm going to quote here from a document which I'll reference in a short while, and I quote, "While identified as a risk group, children with disabilities are currently not effectively protected legally as well. In an online 2002 country report on human rights practices in Trinidad and Tobago, the United States Department of State outlined there was no legislation that specifically enumerates or protects the rights of persons with disabilities or mandates provisions of access to buildings or services. Insufficient and inadequate access to transportation, buildings, and sidewalks was a major obstacle for persons with disabilities. It could be noted, however, that the Equal Opportunities Act, number 69 of 2000, enacted through, at that time but not fully proclaimed, offers some provisions for persons with disabilities, but of course, all the aspects have not been actually materialized. The Convention of the Rights of the Child 1989 also states, quote, all children, including children with disabilities, have a right to special care, education and training that will help him or her attain a full and decent life of dignity and achieve the greatest of self-reliance and social integration possible. That's the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And we have to ask ourselves if our education system is really facilitating this. For a child to achieve a decent life of dignity, achieve the greatest level of self-reliance, it may not be full self-reliance, but certainly the greatest degree available to that child and as socially integrated as possible. And I don't think, as presently constituted, our education system does that. In the International Journal of Special Education, volume 31, 1 of 2016, the title of the article is Effective Practice in Inclusive and Special Needs Education. Best practices in education mandates specific legislative provisions for identification, assessment, categories or categorization, forms of provision, integration, curriculum and pedagogy, resourcing, administration, duties of school and district authorities, monitoring arrangements, teacher training, and parental rights. That is best practices in education, special education. 70%, Mr. Vice President, of developed countries have such legislation, but only 10% of developing countries have specific legislation dealing with special education. Of the 48 countries supplying information in this survey, 33 reported having fewer than 1% of pupils in special schools. Of these, 6 had less than 0.1%. The definition of special needs, according to the World Health Organization. What is a special need? A condition of unexpected underachievement, academic performance significantly below what will be predicted based on individuals' talents, assessment, and potential display from all other areas. The category usually includes, in developed countries, 4 to 5% of all students with disabilities served through education, and up to 8% in developing countries. This means that for the approximately 126,000 primary school students and 100,000 secondary school students for Trinidad and Tobago, we're looking at approximately, if we go by that benchmark, 10,080 primary school students and 8,000 secondary school students who may have some sort of disability, intellectual, cognitive, or physical. Combined, that's approximately just over 18,000 students who may have some level of disability and may not have been diagnosed or remediated in a specific program. Mr. Vice President, why is this important? When we look at, for a benchmark, or SCA performance, which has a 30% benchmark for transition, for saying that you passed, you are able to be transferred, or transferred to secondary level. As the present system is presently applied, we have approximately 2,500 students out of 19,139, which represents 7.7% of those who did not score the 30% required as the benchmark pass, and an unnamed percentage that scored below 40, 50, and 60%, which are all indicators of their level of competence in a particular subject matter or a range of subject matters. I know that is what exists, the 30% benchmark, but when you think about it, a 30% pass benchmark really is a fundamental indication of how much that student understands of the subject matters. And that is our national benchmark for, in parentheses, success. We're selling our young people short. We should expect more of them because they can do better. And I understand it's a benchmark, but when we have that as a benchmark, how are we really preparing globally competitive students? Why not 40%? It may not be politically expedient because you will have a higher rate of students in the present configuration scoring less than that. But it is really not an indication of, to me, what our students can do, given the proper resources and the proper system in place. Mr. Vice President, with that said, we really have to assess ourselves as having done quite well, but also having quite a bit of work to do. And as I indicated before, Mr. Vice President, it may not be because the minister is not trying, or past ministers are not trying. It may be, quite frankly, that we have to revise the system. We have to take a different approach philosophically and practically to our education system. What kind of student do we want to create? What kind of citizen do we want to create? And how is the present system facilitating or not facilitating that? In terms of Trinidad and Tobago, we have a stated policy of inclusion. What is inclusion? Inclusion generally means ending all separate special education placement for students and full-time placement in general education settings with the appropriate special education support within that classroom or situation. So says Lipsky and Gartner, 1996. There are some individuals who, by virtue of their physical, cognitive, and other abilities, require more relevant or appropriate instruction than is usually available within formal or informal educational settings. This domain of education has been constructed to satisfy their particular and specific learning requirements. This domain has been classified as special education, special needs education. And it is a field of special needs education encompassing groups who demand varied services, including visually impaired, hearing impaired, mentally retarded, that was the old phrase, cognitively impaired, orthopedic handicapped, children with behavior and emotional disorders. And it also includes giftedness, because very often when we think of special needs, we only think of students who are falling short. But a comprehensive special needs system also accommodates for students who are gifted in various areas. So they too achieve their potential, which is generally, it's a small, usually 3% of the population. They can actually do more if given more support. So it's not only for students who have challenges, it's also for students who have special gifts. And I'm not only talking about academic gifts, I'm talking sporting gifts, I'm talking cultural and arts gifts, etc. So our system must also accommodate for them. It also provides, an inclusive system also provides for services to students with disabilities, including those with severe impairments in neighborhood schools, as I indicated earlier on. Our rights as enshrined in the Constitution mandates that parents have the right to place their child in whatever school of their choice. But can all schools really accommodate all children? If a parent with a child with a disability says, I want my child in this school. Not necessarily so. Mr. Vice President, in terms of children or learners with disabilities in Trinidad and Tobago, while the World Health Organization estimates that 16 to 20% of children internationally suffer from some sort of disabilities, in 2000, UNDP National Human Development Report conveys information that the prevalence of disabled children in Trinidad and Tobago was 16.3%. This report uses information that was regarded as still applicable even today. The general breakdowns are as follows. Physical disabilities, moderate to severe, 1.7%. Mental retardation, 1%. Emotionally disturbed, 2%. Learning disabilities, 2 to 3%. Hearing disabilities, 4.6%. Speech and language disabilities, moderate or severe, 4.1%. And visual disabilities, severe, 0.7%, making for the total of 16.1%. This report, there's another report also, compiled by the Ministry of Education to identify the prevalence of disabilities in children in Trinidad and Tobago. It's information on the estimated percentage of children with disabilities cited from 2003. The TNT's second periodic report under the Conventions of the Right of the Child is produced, and the report of more than 20 years ago states that 16.1% of all children in the representative survey, a population of 5,040 children ages 3 to 16 years, had some form or degree of disability, with most being hearing, speech, or other language disabilities. A 2000 population and housing census of the Central Statistical Office revealed that between 5,250 to 6,137 persons below the age of 19 confirmed having a disability either related to seeing, hearing, speaking, mobility, movement, gripping, learning behavior, or some other form of disability. These statistics mean that out of the 383,408 persons 0 to 18 years of age, making up approximately at that time 35% of the national population of Trinidad and Tobago, 1.4 to 1.6 of all youths in Trinidad and Tobago or about 0.5% of all Trinbagonians reported a disability. Further to that, the Pan American Health Organization, PAHO, surveyed 7,892 persons between the ages of 8 to 18 and uncovered that 2% had disabilities. The 0 to 4 years age group accounted for 16% of those with disabilities. 5 to 9-year-olds, 39%, 0 to 14-year-olds, 29%, and 15 to 18-year-olds, 16%. Disabilities were related to learning, 25%, sight, 24%, and speech and hearing, 18%. It should be noted that the study did not identify children with emotional disabilities. Mr. Vice President, if I could just give you an example of the difference identification, diagnosis, and remediation can make. I met a young group cohort of aspirant DJs about 12 years ago. They entered a DJ competition, of which I was one of the judges. And one of the young men, he was about 14 years old, was very good, showed great aptitude for music, DJing and stuff. But part of one of the components was, of course, teaching them to read news, because you want to be on the air. We all talk about the abhorrence of people on the air these days, and so we gave them scripts to read. And while he was great in every other area, he struggled in the reading. 14 years old, in Form 3 at the time. So I kept looking at him reading the script, and he kept moving the script forward and backward to his face. So I pulled him aside quietly and I said, "Are you having problems reading?" He said, he got very quiet and insecure about it. He said, "I can't read very well." I said, "Have you ever had your eyes tested?" He said, "No." I said, "Okay, when next you come with your mother or your guardian." He came with his mother, and I asked his mother, "Have you ever had him tested for vision issues?" She said, "No, she didn't have the money." And how was he doing in school? He wasn't doing very well. That's why he entered the DJ competition. Not a good indication for DJs, but what can I say? Fortunately, I knew someone, and I know we're not supposed to call organizations names, but they had been so kind to him. I think it's worth giving him credit. Optometrist today took him in, gave him an eye test, got tested glasses, spectacles for him, and he went through the process, and it improved his reading. 1 year after, his mother called me. His grades had skyrocketed. He was doing better in school. All because, and he was not doing good in school, because his vision issue was not identified and remediated. Think of how many other thousands of young people could be going through that same issue with vision issues, with hearing issues. And this is not to say that the Education Ministry is not providing for that presently, but I am suggesting it's not providing adequately, and we can do, I will go through a protocol called response to intervention that's applied in the UK and the US very successfully, but it's federally funded, and we just have to, in my opinion, find the funding for it in Trinidad and Tobago. According to the Caribbean Medical Journal 2016, it's a multidisciplinary needs for children with autism spectrum disorder, which was done by the Southwest Regional Health Authority in Trinidad and Tobago. And that's why I say there's so much data and so many groups doing good work of research in Trinidad and Tobago about special needs and about the prevalence and services provided that can inform policy decisions and a national framework for better applications. School placement in special needs in autism specifically was 41.6% in private schools and 16.6% in public schools, and 8.3% homeschooled, and 31.6% no schooling. Those students are being left out of the system. 31.6%. 17% of children access the Ministry of Education Student Support Services, and 5% had a psychoeducational assessment. 7% of those students had the support of a teacher's aide. The recent data shows that the lifetime cost of caring for a person with autism in the US stands at between US $1.4 million and $2.3 million. It works out to be approximately $10,000 to $16,000 TT dollars per month. How many families can afford that? And when you go back to the figure of those who are not receiving schooling and those who are homeschooled, you see 36 plus 17%. there is a whole cohort, despite the best efforts of the student support services, not being provided with the support as is guaranteed under our Constitution. And something has to be done about that. And I'm saying this again through you, Mr. Vice President, to the Minister, that I don't think it's your fault. So I'm really hoping we can come together and provide a different kind of framework of support for these students. Mr. Vice President, the student support services as presently exists in Trinidad and Tobago. Special Education Unit was incorporated as a part of the Student Support Division upon its establishment in 2004. The Special Education Unit supports for students with special education needs at the early childhood, primary, secondary levels of school as part of a referral-based multidisciplinary service. The Special Education Unit offers the following services to support early identification and intervention for students with special education needs: school-wide needs assessment, initial observation and screening, diagnostic and standard assessment, training and intervention via school-based team approach, referral for comprehensive psychoeducational assessment, design and implementation of individualized education programs known in special ed as IEPs, curricular accommodation and special concessions for all local examinations. So if you have a special needs, you're given special accommodations for writing the exam. The exam can be given in different formats. You can get extra time in terms of accommodation so that you can actually, it facilitates success. It's not prohibitive. The Special Education Unit currently provides services to students with special needs, which may have resulted in one or more of the following: sensory impairments, vision or hearing or physical impairments, specific learning disabilities, emotional behavioral difficulties, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, mental health disorders, developmental and intellectual disabilities, autism spectrum disorder, ASD, speech and language disorders, physical and health impairments, and, as I said before, giftedness. Currently, according to this information I have, approximately 350 to 450 applications for special concessions are processed annually and administered by the Student Support Services Division, Special Ed Unit. And we see how the great variance in terms of the application to the obvious numbers of students who need services in Trinidad and Tobago that exists in this country. We also have special schools as authorized by the Honorable Minister: School for the Deaf, School for the Blind, Happy Venture Tobago, Princess Elizabeth School, Lady Hochoy Homes, Cocoreed, Penal, Gasparillo, Ishi's Learning Center, and several other private sector organizations. Mr. Vice President, can you tell me how much more time I have? I would hate to run out of time.
Until 3:08.
To 3:08?
At 3:08, yes.
Oh, well, let me move faster then. A brief history of the special needs movement in the U.S. It really had a grassroots beginning. The first advocacy groups to fight for equality or quality special education were made up of parents whose children were marginalized as far back as 1933. The majority of these family associations began making waves in the 1950s when their lobbying encouraged the passage of laws or legal grounding that provided training for teachers who worked with deaf, hard of hearing, or intellectually disabled students. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s had a major impact on the treatment of individuals with disabilities, and its ripple took hold through a series of court cases, one of the most significant and cited being Brown versus the Board of Education, which forever changed the treatment of all students in education because of the change in educational law and procedure, which had a tremendous effect on school policies, procedures, and the rights of differently abled students and their families' access to education as mandated by the law. It wasn't about a supervisor or somebody saying, well, yes or no. The parents had legal grounds upon which to ask or demand for their children's special education needs. The Brown case put desegregation, because it was a segregation issue of black students in white schools, and that stopped that and started a ripple effect into the other aspects of special needs in the U.S. In 1973, another important act was passed, the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504, as is often referenced, that stated that any agency or activity receiving federal funding could not discriminate against or deny benefits or support to students or individuals with disabilities. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 also guaranteed civil rights to all disabled people and required accommodations for disabled students in schools. Then came IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which was a landmark bit of legislation in 1997, which emphasized the use of individual education plans. We apply those to some extent in Trinidad and Tobago, or IEPs. It also initiated the use of individualized transition plans for students of different age groups, so 3 to 5, 6 to 9, 10 to 15, 16, and even transitioning out of school to ensure that these persons, in some cases, had the requisite support to lead dignified lives and full lives. But again, it was based in law. It wasn't nebulous at all. It was very specific in terms of what parents could demand and what funding could be demanded under federal guidelines. And then came 2001 and 2004, No Child Left Behind, or NCLB, not NLCB, NCLB, which provided further accountability to schools and added technological assistance and loan programs to help schools acquire needed special ed resources. Now that the basic rights had been set in place, advocacy groups similar to those that we see in Trinidad and Tobago, like the Down Syndrome Family Network and Autism Today, had legal remit. They had the teeth of the law on their sides. They could actually go and say, listen, we want to ensure that this learner or this group of learners has the requisite support. There are entire educational districts in Trinidad and Tobago, to my knowledge, that are scoring below benchmark. It can't be the students. It has to be the system. And we have to do something about that. According to a World Health Organization report, about 15% of the world's population lives with some form of disability, of whom 2 to 4% experience significant difficulties in functioning. The global disability prevalence is higher than previous WHO estimates, which date back to the 1970s. Currently, 10% is estimated that 10% of the world's population, or roughly 650 million people, live with a disability, most in OECD or developing countries. And females have higher rates of disabilities than males. And as the population ages, this figure is expected to increase. To underscore again, because I think examples, real-life examples, really are what best underscores the need for some kind of comprehensive legislative change and legal grounding for special needs groups. There's a family member of mine whose name I shall not call, who struggled in primary school. I mean, struggled in secondary school. And I remember a situation where there's a story told where his father had him reading, and he kept reading WAS as SAW. Licks. Read it again. SAW. Read it again. But that's what I'm seeing. 2 years after that, he was taken to a specialist because he struggled through primary and secondary school. Low grades, because of course, we now know that he suffered from dyslexia. And dyslexia is a group of conditions, not necessarily one condition. It was identified, diagnosed, and remediated. His grades soared. He's now a successful civil engineer. What would have happened to him if that family didn't have the resources to take him for private remediation? What is happening to scores of families right now who don't have the means, who we know that student support services, though well-intentioned, is overburdened? Why are we allowing this cohort of our population not to access what everybody else is doing? Do those parents love their children or want any less for their children? Our system has to support them. Has to. I have 8 minutes left and I have a lot to get through. Response to intervention is one of the ways or protocols we can introduce in Trinidad and Tobago, which is a 3-tiered assessment program. No student should go from standard 1 to standard 5 to score 20% in an exam. This system is a system of assessment where the entire classroom goes through tier 1. Those who don't score the benchmark go back and the curriculum is differentiated. Different teaching methods. If they still don't score, respond to that, they go to tier 3 where they are referenced or referred for a special needs assessment. this doesn't only apply to academic benchmarks. It also applies for behavioral emotional benchmarks. It can be used to identify students who may end up truant or violently inclined. And we know we've had in the past, it seems to be on the decline in Trinidad and Tobago, problems with student behaviors. And this response to intervention methodology can certainly play a role if it is funded properly and applied properly in identifying and diagnosing and remediating and monitoring students who are falling below benchmark. So we don't have to get to 2,400 students not scoring 30% in an SCA examination. That is not on them, that is on us. We should have recognized after 3 semesters that this student has an issue. We should have put things in place to identify and provide remediation for those 2,400 students. And ironically, if you do the calculation for gang population in Trinidad and Tobago, we realize we are basically handing some of these students to gangs because they're going to find validation somewhere else. If not in the schools, somewhere else. And we see the problem we have with gangs in Trinidad and Tobago. Response to intervention mandates high quality, scientifically and empirically based classroom instruction, ongoing student assessment, tiered instruction, teacher collaboration, student and teacher collaboration, student collaboration between peers, support in terms of the general teacher's role, special education teachers in almost every classroom. I know it's a funding issue also, but we have to change our philosophy to education. Long gone are the days in terms of best practice where one student is managing a class of 40. That is not necessarily a recipe for success, although we've had success with that. Students participating in the learning community, adaptation processes, including mastery of learning, classroom facilities and environmental classroom management protocols, learning materials, technological and otherwise, and different kinds of instructional modalities. Mr. Vice President, as I indicated before, this motion is not aimed, and I keep stressing that because I know sometimes motions can seem aimed at denigrating the work of the minister in question or the government in question. It is not in any way intended to do that. It's intended to just raise some points, hopefully, so that we can come to some consensus and hopefully form a committee is my hope to ensure that we can review what is there, what we have working for us, what is not working, and provide solutions for particularly these vulnerable groups. I work with the Down Syndrome Family Network, I work with Autism Society and other groups regularly. And the cries of parents who, there's a particular father who broke my heart, who came to one of the seminars 2 years ago, and he has 2 sons, 2 children who have been diagnosed with Down syndrome. And he actually was asked to go back every year to prove his children had Down syndrome. So, you know, and it's not a ministry thing, it's an education and awareness and an evolution of thinking thing. You know, and he said he has not a holiday in 15 years because his second son is 12 and his first son is 14. So every bit of his resources goes towards supporting, and he accesses services from the Student Support Services, Ministry of Education. But it is simply not enough as presently configured. So he has the same aspirations for his sons, but he just needs more support. Martin Luther King, Mr. Vice President, said that the function of education is to teach everyone to think intensively and think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. And character for me, for a person or a nation, means justice, equality, and equality of treatment for all. This is, to me, I hope, taken as part of the earnestly and sincerely as part of what I suggest could be a great reform process, to change in attitudes, values, and belief systems about persons with different types of abilities and disabilities, because very often we hear, because we have to change ourselves as a nation, we hear someone say a Down syndrome's child. No, It is a child with Down syndrome because the child is first. The Down syndrome doesn't define the child. And language is important because that's a person who needs our support. We need a nationwide re-education program aimed at changing perceptions about persons with disabilities and different abilities, and how we treat as a nation, support and provide for persons with disabilities and special needs. State, private sector has a role. Civil society, we must all work together. Mr. Vice President, in a very diverse nation, our education system is the one socializing agency that can ensure that every citizen feels valued. The education system is the one opportunity for all students to be able to move past their birth circumstance and become, believe, and begin to change their lives for the better. Our education system is the one common socializing agency that ensures that we inculcate the values and practices that we can all cling to as a nation. Equality, justice, kindness, caring, cannot be taken for granted. But the education system must be guided and grounded in law. It gives families rights to equality of treatment, as enshrined in our Constitution. This equality that mandates being provided with the resources so that every type and category of learner, of student, can learn and achieve their fullest potential. If this education system is not providing this kind of protection equally for citizens, then we're propagating inequality and injustice, even if it's not overt. And that is not the goal of a progressive education system. I'm hoping that we can together add new layers of protection that can ensure equality of treatment and the legal redress to ensure that those opportunities, and all citizens can sing, to me, what is one of the most important lines in our anthem. Every creed and race finds an equal place. And actually believe it. I end by underscoring the creed of my alma mater, Hillview College, and its song, which says that all things concerning human kin are ours to champion, particularly for vulnerable groups. Mr. Vice President, with those few words, I thank you, and I beg to move.
Senator Seepersad.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I beg to second the motion and reserve my right to speak at a later stage.
The motion has been seconded by Senator Seepersad. Honourable Senators, I will now propose the question for debate. The question is, whereas Section 6.2 of the Education Act, Chapter 3901, provides that the Ministry of Education should provide special schools suitable to the requirements of students with physical and learning disabilities, and whereas the Ministry has not provided students with disabilities, additional learning needs, and/or challenging behaviors with the requisite support networks and equal opportunities needed to achieve their full potential, and whereas the lack of adequate funding, policies, and specialist staff is reflected in the poor performance of students. Be it resolved that this Senate call on the government to commit to the allocation of adequate funding, reform of the appropriate legislation, and revision of policies designed to ensure that all children with special needs are provided with the equal educational opportunities to other students. And be it further resolved that the Ministry of Education immediately initiate and implement a comprehensive strategy to assist all children with disabilities, additional learning needs, and/or challenging behaviors. Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. It is instructive that Senator Richards ended his presentation by quoting the anthem of his alma mater. Senator Richards knows that Hillview College is the school that I attended also. So at least we share something in common. Mr. Vice President, I was at pains, really, to get an idea of the direction in which Senator Richards was going. Because if you look at the recitals and we examine them carefully, his presentation was totally different from what has been said in the recitals. In the recitals, he spoke about the Ministry of Education must provide special schools for students with physical and learning disabilities, as though the Ministry of Education has not provided such schools. He said the Ministry of Education has not provided students who suffer disabilities or learning needs and or challenging behaviors with requisite support networks and equal opportunities needed to achieve their full potential. And he went on to say that there's a lack of adequate funding, there's a lack of policies, there's a lack of specialist staff, and that is reflected in the poor performance of students. Mr. Vice President, as I said before, when I listened carefully to Senator Richards's presentation, it was totally different from what is here. It is simply because, from my estimation, that at the back of Senator Richards's mind, he is fully aware of what this Ministry of Education and this government is doing in the field of education for this country. Let me begin with the first recital, that the Ministry of Education must provide special schools for students with physical and learning disabilities. Mr. Vice President, the Ministry of Education has 13 government and government-assisted schools, which according to the Education Act is referred to as public schools. And these schools offer a wide range of assistance to students. And I can call some of these schools the Audrey Jeffers School for the Deaf, the Cascade School for the Deaf, the Princess Elizabeth Special School for the Physically Handicapped, the Pointe-a-Pierre Government Special School, the School for the Blind, the Wharton Patrick Special School, the Lady Hochoy School in Coquerit, the Lady Hochoy School in Gasparilla, the Lady Hochoy School in Pinal, the Lady Hochoy School in Arima, the Interdisciplinary Child Development Center in Cuba, in Tobago, the Tobago School for the Deaf, Speech and Language Impaired, and the Happy Haven Special Schools. These are 13 schools that the government provides assistance in terms of payment of teachers, payment of principals, and so on. And therefore, these schools are regarded as public schools. There are 14 private schools in Trinidad and Tobago to which the government gives assistance. Senator Richards mentioned some, I will mention others. Ishi's Learning Center, Goodwill Industries of the West Indies, Imami's Learning Center, Serval Special School, Palmyra's Learning Center, Immortal Children's Center for Special Education, New Beginnings, Happy Vente Special Schools, the Rio Claro Learning and Development Center for Special Children. Where these schools are concerned, Mr. Vice President, the government offers assistance in the area of, or in the areas of, special education needs. There are student grants of $2,000 per student, additional financial assistance grant up to $1,000 per student, depending on the level of that student's disabilities, the provision of specialized services grants for the provision of funding for specialized assessment and therapy, staffing grants with respect to salaries of qualified staff, funding for running costs, for example, utility bills, where they pay 100% of the utility bills, telephone bills, water and sewage, WASA, electricity bills, and so on, and upkeep of grounds. Mr. Vice President, this tells us quite clearly that this ministry and this government is cognizant of our responsibility, where children who are afflicted with special needs are concerned, and we are doing everything possible to ensure that their needs are taken care of adequately. Mr. Vice President, again, Senator Richards began his contribution by stating that he would want to focus on two fundamental rights that are enshrined in our Constitution, Section 4 of the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago. And he named them: the right to equality of treatment by public bodies, and the other, the right of a parent to a school of choice for his child. I listened quite attentively to hear Senator Richards speak on this or to expand on this. I did not hear any mention at all. You see, Mr. Vice President, I don't know where anywhere in the education system, which is a public body, that students are deprived of equal treatment. I don't know. This Ministry of Education is built on four important planks. One is equity, and the other one is access. And equity and access working together will ensure that there is no discrimination in terms of equal treatment of our students who suffer disabilities. In terms of the right of a parent to a school of choice for his child, again, I was listening quite carefully to see exactly where he was going. Let me just say, Madam and Mr. Vice President, that no right is unfettered. No right is absolute. There are always circumstances that will affect whatever right is enshrined in the Constitution. In many instances, in many cases, persons do not quite understand this provision in the Constitution which talks about the right of a parent of choice for his child. It doesn't mean, and I heard, listen carefully, I heard Senator Richards say that a parent has the right to decide which school his child is going to be sent to. That is not what it says, no. It simply says the parent has a right of choice. That is the operative word. But that choice depends on so many other variables. For example, location. At the level of the primary school, if a child lives outside the catchment area, the chances of that child being admitted to that school will be very slim, because there might be others who live in the catchment area and they will have first options. But in terms of the essay exams, where, you know, lots of people talk about this, because people come to me and they say, well, you know, this is against my constitutional rights. I have a right of choice, and my child has a right to attend X, Y, Z school. That right will depend on the performance of the child at the exam. So I make it clear that no right is absolute. And we have to understand that. But still, in Senator Richards' presentation, I did not hear him elaborate where this was concerned. Again, there was a bit of contradiction in what Senator Richards said, because he said quite clearly, he quoted over the last 10 years that almost $90 billion was spent on education. And in his own words, he said that this perhaps was adequate, this is a lot of money, but still in his recital, he said there's not adequate funding. There will never be adequate funding for education. Education is most dynamic. And we will always need additional resources, additional financial resources, additional physical resources, because of the nature of education. But to say that we are not adequately funding education is not totally correct. This government has placed a number of resources, financial and otherwise, to ensure that our students in this country are able to benefit from the quality education that we are determined to provide. A quality education that will see children from early childhood right on to tertiary education levels, and also students of all different classes, students who are afflicted with disabilities, we do everything to ensure that those students are taken into consideration. Another point that Senator Richards spoke about was a 30% benchmark for SEA. So, Senator Richards, there is no benchmark for the SEA. There's no benchmark. The SEA is a placement exam. I wish to repeat that. The SEA is a placement exam. We would like all our students to score at least 50% in all the subjects. But to say that there's a benchmark of 30%, that is not correct. It's simply because the SEA is a placement exam. I hope I correct that. So that deals with the first recital that is contained in this resolution with respect to schools being provided or not being provided by this government. And I've just shown that there are 13 public schools and 14 private schools that government has invested a lot where this is concerned. The other recital talks about the lack of support networks and equal opportunities for our students. As I said just now, our education system is based on 4 major pillars. I recounted 2: access and equity, quality education is another, and the parental involvement is also another. I already spoke about access, and access to the special schools that we're having, 14 and 13. I also spoke about equity, but let me state, and again, Senator Richards quoted some figures. In 2015 to 2016, that academic year, we did a survey involving 308 primary and secondary schools. And as a result of this survey, 1,689 students were diagnosed with disabilities. 1,689. In addition to this, our Student Support Services Division, in going out to our schools, have identified 1,850 students who might be suffering from some mild disability. And also in 2017-2018, approximately 3,500 of our students are suspected to be impacted with one or more disabilities. With this information in mind, or with this information at hand, Mr. Vice President, officers of the Student Support Services Division have been visiting our schools regularly. In the case of primary schools, we have distributed our personnel in such a way that every primary school will have an opportunity of accessing the professional expertise of these persons. In case of the secondary schools, we have a number of those persons who are physically implanted in those schools. And therefore, students have access to the assistance that could be given in these areas. In addition to this, there's a multidisciplinary approach with respect to our SSSD, Student Support Services Division, and this cuts across all 7 education districts in Trinidad and Tobago. And services are provided by our trained personnel, trained psychologists, behavioral psychologists, and so on, in areas of special education, and more importantly, the provision of special education aids in schools, mostly in the primary schools where students need that assistance. We also try our best to provide sign language interpreters in our primary schools and in some instances in our secondary schools. Because as you know, we have integrated to a large extent students who are blind, but in some cases, students who are deaf and who are dumb. So we have sign language interpreters, assistants, who are also present in many of our schools. And we do everything to ensure that those students who suffer some disability, when they have to write the exams, all national exams, they are provided with assistance. Senator Richards spoke about that. They are provided with assistance in terms of time. In some cases, you have somebody who would sit next to them and assist them. So in other words, what we are saying is we are catering for the needs of all our students. So it is not true to say that there is not the provision of support and equal opportunities for these students. Let's look at recital number 3. Senator Richards speaks about the lack of adequate funding, the lack of policies, and the lack of specialized staff. Well, we already dealt with adequate funding, and as I stated before, we will always have the need for more and more funding. Education is dynamic, and it will need as much money as possible. But in terms of policies, right now before our cabinet, there is a draft paper on education. And this draft paper came into being because of consultations that we had. The consultation started in 2016. And there were 3 such consultations, one in North, one in South, and one in Tobago. And as a result of those consultations and the views expressed by those persons who participated, the Ministry of Education technical officers compiled a document that was taken to Cabinet with recommendations. Cabinet decided that we should go out again and seek some more information and embark on another consultation, which we did. And again, that consultation was held at 3 venues, in North Trinidad, South Trinidad, and Tobago. And as a result of all of these consultations and all of the opinions expressed and the advice given, remember, we had given every person in Trinidad and Tobago the opportunity to comment on the education system. So everybody, including the good senator, had an opportunity to comment on the education system. And as a result of these consultations, a draft paper was presented to Cabinet. Cabinet approved the paper and asked us again to look at it because we want to bring it to Parliament as a white paper. We did some examination, some tweaking of it, some of the areas that we felt needed some more information. We provided the additional information, and right now it is before Cabinet, and we are hoping that in a week or 2, Cabinet will take a decision on that white paper on education. That white paper covers all aspects of education, including education of the special child. And all of the things that have been called upon, that have been asked of, all those things are included in that document. So when it is presented to Parliament, you will see exactly what we have been doing in the area of special education, but in particular in the area of general education. Mr. Vice President, this Ministry of Education has been working assiduously to ensure that not one of our children is disadvantaged. We are working assiduously to ensure that we provide the necessary supports for our students at every level of the education system. But today, as we talk about special education, just let me reveal some information, some further information that will be relevant. In Trinidad and Tobago, in our education system, we have a section that is referred to as the Student Support Services Division. And within that division, there are approximately 550 persons. That division has been established, again, as Senator Richards said, in 2004, to look at the needs, in particular, of special children. At present, there are in excess, or let me put it another way, the number of established positions in the special education section of the Student Support Services Division is in excess of 500 positions. That tells you that we have so many persons who are on board to ensure that our students are adequately taken care of, and therefore it is not accurate to say that we don't have the requisite staffing. Mr. Vice President, in that section at present, there are 61 special education instructors who have been trained so that they can ensure that even those teachers' aides who sit in the classrooms next to the students will be able to provide adequate and proper information and proper guidance. Also, Mr. Vice President, the University of the West Indies and the University of the Southern Caribbean, over the last 5 years, have included in their program training of teachers in the area of special education. In other words, Mr. Vice President, at UWI, teachers, persons with that interest, can avail themselves of opportunities where they can be trained at the tertiary level and come back to the schools. At the level of the University of the Southern Caribbean, the same thing happens. We at the Ministry of Education are looking at every opportunity where we can enhance the performance of our teachers through training. And therefore, adequate training opportunities are being provided to ensure that our teachers are adequately trained. Senator Richards also spoke about policies. And he said that there are no policies. In his recitals, he said there are no policies. I spoke just now about the draft or the white paper that is before Cabinet. And it's really a policy document, but attached to that is also documents that will tell us how we are going to roll out these policies. But let me share some information with respect to policies for the benefit of members of this House. The Ministry of Education proposes as policy to increase the resource allocation for students at public special schools currently under the direct supervision of the Ministry of Education's Special Education Unit. The Ministry of Education proposes to initiate the planned upgrade of 3 schools in each education district at each level, at the level of the ECC, at the level of primary, and at the level of secondary, to accommodate students with physical and sensory disabilities. At these 3 levels, we have identified 3 schools in each district where we're going to provide the adequate resources. The Ministry of Education will provide adequately equipped resource rooms in 1 out of every 3 to 5 primary schools for the provision of special education assessment and intervention services to students with special education needs. I continue. The Ministry of Education will refurbish and expand the existing Braille unit. Yes, there is a Braille unit to alternative multimedia resource center. We are going to expand the Braille unit. The Ministry of Education will engage in an aggressive recruitment and training program to ensure increased capacity of the Student Support Services Division to address the identified special education needs of all of our students. In spite of the fact that the Student Support Services Division is at present staffed by approximately 500, we are going to aggressively pursue the increase in those establishments so that more teachers will have every opportunity to interface with students with special needs. The Ministry of Education will facilitate the provision of comprehensive diagnostic assessment and therapeutic intervention services through allocation of funding for specialized services. Where we don't have these services in-house, we'll go outside. And as you know, this government has embarked on a whole government approach, so we have been working closely with the Ministry of Health so that our students will have the benefit of intervention at that level that cannot be provided in schools. And the Ministry of Education will facilitate the provision and maintenance of educational material, equipment, and instructional resources to support special education intervention by way of annual budgetary allocation. These are some of the policy areas, the policy directives that we are going to embark on as soon as possible. Mr. Vice President, a point was made by Senator Richards in which he identified a case where a student was afflicted with dyslexia and it wasn't recognized. And he asked the question, how many persons in Trinidad and Tobago are undergoing such problems? One of the pillars on which we are building this education system is parental support, parental intervention, or parental assistance. And we have been working hard, again through our Student Support Services Division, in going outside the schools, meeting our parents, to ensure that our parents play an important part in the education of their children. Because we recognize, as every educator will recognize, that you cannot do it alone. The school system cannot do it alone. We will need the active support of the parents. Where students are afflicted with such challenges that have been identified by the good senator, we are training our parents, first of all, in how to identify the affliction. I want to make it clear what I'm saying. We are not telling them how to solve the problem. But the first intervention must be on the part of the parent. And we are training our parents how to identify some of these afflictions. The second area of identification will be the teacher. In the primary school or the early childhood centers, it is the class teacher who is being trained to identify and have discussions with the parents. So we will not wait until the situation reaches proportions where the child is doing very badly. That intervention must come from very early. And that's one of the things that we are doing. And then when that happens, the teacher, the class teacher, will be able to get in contact with the professionals in the field. Persons from the Student Support Services Division who will visit the school and prescribe another type of intervention depending on the severity of the ailment. And we'll go up further and further if it requires the intervention of the Ministry of Health, then the person will be referred to the Ministry of Health. In other words, we are doing everything possible to ensure that every child in our system has an equal opportunity to access the quality of education that we are determined to provide. Mr. Deputy President, Mr. Vice President, I understand Senator Richards' concern. I truly understand his concern. And in fact, I appreciate his sentiments because as an educator, a person who has spent 39 of my working years in the field of education, I understand some of the problems that parents and others will undergo and would experience. And therefore, I am happy to join hands with Senator Richards in ensuring that whatever we can do to assist our children can be done. Because as I keep repeating, no one can do it alone. The Ministry of Education cannot do it alone. We need the active support of all the stakeholders. And once we get that support, then our children will be well on the way to achieving their full potential. However, I just want to caution, we have to be careful in making the type of remarks that are contained in the recitals that will give the impression that this Ministry of Education is doing nothing or doing very little, while and when we are doing so much to assist our students with disabilities. I thank you very much.
Senator Haynes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I'd just like to start by thanking Senator Richards for bringing this very, very important motion. The Minister of Education's response reflected the urgency, I think, for this motion. Because as I pondered the motions brought by Senator Richards, I saw that it called for us as a parliament, in its essence, as parliamentarians to, and as a nation actually, to evaluate how we think about learning, how we think about education, how we think about abilities, those with challenges, equity within our system, accessibility in the greater context, greater than physical accessibility. And it invited us to think critically about where we are now and where we need to be as a country with our education system. And that is how I viewed the motion. The Minister of Education, however, chose to take a defensive approach in his response to the motion brought by Senator Richards, where defensiveness was not necessary, in my opinion. You see, defensiveness is a barrier to communication and is a barrier to progress. Because what Senator Richards sought to do was highlight that we are not where we should be when it comes to equity in our education system, looking specifically at children with special needs. In that context, I think we can all agree, and I'll get to a policy document, the National Policy on Persons with Disability, where the fact that we are not where we want to be has been admitted by this very same government. And therefore, I did not understand the defensiveness coming from the Minister of Education today. I had hoped that the minister would have taken the opportunity to listen to the very thorough presentation put forward by Senator Richards and say, Trinidad and Tobago, yes, we can do better. And let us all come together to do better. Unfortunately, that is not what we got. We got the defense in a space where Senator Richards did not even seek to attack the ministry, and he made that very clear throughout his presentation. But defensiveness comes from a space that does not allow for an honest assessment of the situation as it stands. And I can understand, in the context of our political system and elections and campaigns, that there may not be any space right now for the government to honestly assess the situation as it stands. But how the minister sought to present today, it also appeared to be remarkably out of touch with the situation faced by by many citizens who have children with special needs, or who have special needs and are part of our education system as it stands. And I thought, as I reflected on the minister's contribution in terms of all of the things that had been done and all the programs that are put in place, where is our honest evaluation on whether or not these programs are working for the benefit of those it is intended to work for? Before I get into the substance of my contribution, I attended St. Joseph's Convent, San Fernando. And as part of our preparation for university, we had extracurricular activities, co-curricular activities. You got to choose from a spectrum in terms of how you would serve your community. They offered going into the hospitals and, playing with and teaching children who are abandoned in the hospital system. But there was also a space for you to tutor young children in primary school who would not have been able to afford extra lessons or access to tutors. I opted to tutor students in Maribel Anglican Primary School. So as Form 6 students, we went into schools. Now, what we were going to do was most of the children who were part of that program, their parents could not pick them up from school at 3 p.m. So they needed supervision. And our convent and the primary school kind of worked out. So we were, in effect, babysitters, but you'd go over their homework, you'd help them go through some of the work. When we arrived at that school, there were students there now we had all age groups from first year to standard 5. There were students there who were about to write the SEA examination who could not read, right? So they were in standard 5, they could not read. And you think about it, and you think about what that means, and our reflexive action may be to blame the teachers, and there's a lot of blame going around. But how do we think about learning ability in Trinidad and Tobago? Would you watch a child who is in standard 5, who may not be able to read, and say, this may be a child with special needs, or is this just a difficult child? Put this child in the back of the classroom, get rid of them. They can't learn. What is the true context in Trinidad and Tobago culture for treatment with children? Do we even have a current system of students going into schools where you are assessed properly to see if you have a learning disability, or in cases if you have special needs on the other end of the spectrum? Is that system currently in place for assessment of all students? So therefore, how are you putting things into place? Right? All of these things that the minister spoke about are being put into place to deal with students, when the fundamental question of whether or not we have an effective, equitable, overall assessment of all students going into our school system to say where they ought to be placed and in what is their learning ability as it stands, that we are then tailoring these interventions to the problem that we actually have? Or is it that we are just calling out things in our list? It's a laundry list. Look, we did this, we did that, we did the next thing, and be satisfied with that. The minister also mounted a defense in terms of the money spent. Senator Richards was very clear. The question isn't how much It is how is the money being spent? Is it being allocated in a sensible fashion? Is it being allocated to solve the problems that we actually have? Or are you just throwing money into a system with no care for how it is being used within the system? As it stands, Mr. Vice President, we are looking at an education system, as Senator Richards pointed out, as the Minister of Education pointed out, that has benefited from significant amounts of budgetary allocations. Most years it's either first or second, but probably just below national security. For the past 2 budget responses, I have asked the question. The question isn't how much money is going into it or what is the allocation, but are you addressing specific concerns? Are you trying to create better citizens? Are you trying to create a better education system? Or are you pumping money into an essentially flawed system? And the minister, in his response, did not really give us any context in terms of how the programs that he listed were being monitored and evaluated for effectiveness and efficiency. There was none of that. So it is really a question of, this is what we're doing, you should be happy about it. But I want to just go into the government's policy on the national policy on persons with disabilities. This was updated in 2018, and I felt like it would be a useful starting point given what Senator Richards' motion asked for. And I started with the glossary of terms where they looked at inclusive education. And inclusive education refers to persons with and without disabilities learning together in preschool provision, schools, colleges, universities, with the appropriate network of support. Right. Let us again now think about what currently obtains. But before we go there, Senator Richards gave a definition for special needs from WHO. And when I was thinking in terms of what special needs means, and as I looked at the national policy on persons with disabilities, a lot of it focused heavily on physical disabilities, fixing the spaces, etc. Very important work. This is not in any way to diminish that work. That is critical, and as far as possible as we can move forward in that regard, I am all for it. However, it excludes a significant number of persons with a term that I learned today, which would be invisible disabilities. And there's a campaign on invisible disabilities, as in things that you can't see. We cannot see it. So the term special needs is a catch-all phrase which refers to a vast array of diagnoses and disabilities, including things like Down syndrome, terminal illness, profound cognitive impairment, from serious psychiatric problems. So you're talking learning abilities, you're talking developmental delays, you're talking about a wide spectrum of persons and people can fall anywhere along the spectrum and it be considered special needs, which is why I started off by saying, when the minister chose to respond, there was a very important space because there's a silence in terms of how we assess persons going into our education system. And the motion brought by Senator Richards called for us to commit for the allocation of adequate funding and to reform appropriate legislation and the revision of policies. A very useful starting point, I think, for the revision of policies when it comes to persons with special needs would be our assessment function. Now, given that the minister was unable to say, and I think it's because there was a difficulty in hearing where there were spaces for improvement. So instead of coming to say, this is what we will be doing, we got the defense. But at a Monday night forum last year, mid last year, the United National Congress by our political leader, Mrs. Charrise began rolling out our policies for national development. The education policy being a central tenet for our developmental thrust, Mrs. Seepersad being a former Minister of Education. And a big part of what was rolled out on that day, and I'll put it into the record, is that the United National Congress, on becoming government of Trinidad and Tobago, will introduce free psychological assessment for preschool students in 9 categories. You're looking at academic, behavioral, social, emotional, adaptive functioning, fine or gross motor, speech and language, for example, autism and dyslexia. And therefore, we can adjust teaching to suit the children in need and preventing problems from occurring later on in their school life. So we looked at the problem, right? We've opened our consultations, and coming from our consultations in the education sector, that was one of the policies that we put in place. It directly answers some of the questions raised by Senator Richards, which is, how do you intend to improve the system? We intend to start from the very beginning. We intend to say, listen, you are coming into the school system. How can we create better students, better citizens? How can we make our education system more inclusive? And this is how we will do it. Coming from that, another policy that was listed that we will implement would be ongoing yearly psychological testing for students. So that's how you evaluate whether or not your systems, the systems that you've put in place, are working. Added to that was skills training for teachers, the skills training for the teachers to, again, treat with the students, to be able to treat with students with varying abilities on the spectrum. So, Mr. Vice President, what we've done is taken into consideration that our education system is not as inclusive as it ought to be. And it comes from how we, as a nation, think about abilities and disabilities and learning abilities, etc. And again, now this is not to lay blame at any, but as you evolve as a society, as you evolve as an individual, you must recognize that, one, you weren't born knowing everything. So you aren't born with an infinite amount of knowledge. So your initial reaction to a person with a learning disability, or a person that is just different from you, because it doesn't even need to amount to a learning ability. It could amount to just differences in the ways that you learn. For example, I can absorb information quickly, but if I write something down, I'll remember it. There are people who learn by doing, kinetic learning, and all of these things. And whether or not our system is tailored for all of these things is something that we can assess, and it is a conversation that Senator Richards would have opened by starting at this point, looking at children with special needs, but an overall consideration of whether or not our education system is working to create better citizens. And in that space, again, I would say I did not understand the minister's defensiveness. I'll go to what the national policy on persons with disabilities, prepared by the Ministry of Social Development, again revised in 2018, said specifically about the education system. It said, in order for persons with disabilities to participate fully in their environment, there must be equal opportunity for education, training of equal standard to peers, and the promotion of inclusion in schools. Precisely what Senator Richards was talking about. Now, while the minister again spoke about the schools that we have, schools for the hearing impaired, etc., you see that there's also a concept of separate but equal, right? And if your policy, as stated by the government, and you're talking about the all-of-government approach, I don't know that the minister read this particular policy document, but it spoke very specifically to the promotion of inclusion in schools. All right? And the document goes on to say, access to education from primary level for persons with disabilities must be inclusive and should cater to varied requirements of persons with disabilities. The Ministry of Social and Family Services, the Ministry of Education, and all relevant stakeholders are supposed to be working together to implement this. Now, again, I left this as is, and I left a section for notes because I assumed the checklist as put forward by the Ministry of Social Development was so thorough that the Minister of Education would have tailored his response by looking at this checklist presented in this national policy for persons with disabilities and say, okay, this is where where we've gotten to. There are two things. There's the education segment and there's an action plan, and I'll get to the action plan as well because the minister could have used that to say, this is what we've done, this is what we've attained by our own policy. That was not done. Again, what we saw was a defense, and I assume the defense comes from just wanting to find a way to pat yourself on the back for a laundry list of things that you seem to be doing, whether or not it works.
Manufacturing achievements.
Yes. So they talk about appropriate legislation for inclusiveness in the education system. But this is where I think it gets, this is where I think the minister had an opportunity to tell us where they had gotten to. It speaks about reviewing and ensuring adequate allocation of appropriate resources for physical and information accessibility, funding for and delivery for inclusive education. So when you talk about the funding, the Ministry of Education, in conjunction with the Ministry of Social Development, according to a document they produced in 2018, is in the process of reviewing and ensuring adequate allocation. Now, this comes to a very important part of Senator Richards' motion. So what I thought the minister was coming here to do was take this document, say, this is where we're at with the review. We've allocated X amount of money last year or fiscal 2017. In our estimation, this was done well. This could have been done better. In the next fiscal year, we would look to reallocate X, Y, and Z. That was not done. Because I assume now that level of thinking and rationale is not how this ministry is run. It is just a matter of, look, we're going to put this money here, and tell them, look, we do this, be cool with that, right? Going on, there's supposed to be reviewing and restructuring of the delivery of the national curriculum to ensure that it is inclusive for persons with disabilities. Critical. Critical. If you're talking inclusion, if you're talking equity, you have to be talking the national curriculum. You have to be talking about it. As it stands, our system benefits test takers, right? I am a test taker, excellent test taker, really well. So the system benefited me throughout. But I know people who were better at continuous assessment. And by the way, test taking is largely memory, yeah? So, right? It's not, it is memory and it is how you work under pressure. Two things. But our system, and this is going beyond persons with special needs, it's just looking at an education system catering to all citizens, right? An equitable education system, which is what I thought we were coming here to discuss. No word from the minister, none, about the review and restructuring of the delivery of the national curriculum. None. Right? Right. Reviewing of training programs to ensure required skills in early identification and intervention strategies for students. Now, I gave you what the UNC and Kamala Persad-Bissessa approach will be once we return to government. The minister raised no point on early identification because that didn't even factor in to his response.
Yes.
All right. the review and modification of the process for access to scholarship to ensure equality of opportunities for persons with disabilities. Very good point. Nothing from the minister. Nothing. Which again leads me to believe nothing is being done here. And so while in terms of looking at persons who have access to scholarships, you're looking at persons with special needs, and I thought, the minister was talking about training opportunities. And if you want to improve our system, there's a lot of things that you can do, right? So when you're talking personnel, and I wrote this down as the minister was speaking, a very simple measure in terms of how you can get more persons with specialized training for dealing with children with special needs into our school system, using your much touted all of government approach would be to take Ministry of Public Admin, you look at your scholarship offerings, you look at your or financial aid offerings or student loans, right? And you say to students, because we do have a problem of persons going into tertiary education, graduating and cannot find employment. We are now here recognizing that there is a space for persons who have specialized training in dealing with children with special needs in the education system. While the minister seems to be satisfied with the numbers as is, I would like to premise that we can do better. And one way we can do better is by saying we can offer scholarships for persons who are going into those areas, or you can offer student loan forgiveness programs. For example, if you take this, so you did not qualify for a scholarship on the academic merit, you go into school, and the university I went to did this for students who were studying speech pathology. But you can take along any level of specialization and say, okay, you've taken student loans to get this degree. You come into our public education system, and if you got student loans, I think there's help offered by the government. I'm not sure what our student loan system is. But you took a student loan offered through the government, there's debt forgiveness as you work through. So you work within the public. This allows you to fill gaps in the public education system. Then when you finished working there, you have the requisite experience where you can then open specialist schools. There's a space for entrepreneurship. There's a space for you to grow in a career path. Again, if you really want to seek solutions, if you really wanted solutions, these things are not impossible to enact. The systems are there. All it needs is some creativity and for people to take an honest look at what is going on, an honest look at what the system is as it stands, and act in accordance with that, instead of coming here and being defensive and saying, this is what we did, look how great it is, don't come here and tell us we're not doing anything, which was not what Senator Richards was trying to do. It might be what I am saying, but it's not what Senator Richards was trying to do, right? It goes on to say the implementation of adequate measures to ensure children with disabilities who require education in special schools are provided with appropriate staff, equipment, and trained personnel. So this is where the minister's point about specialist schools came in. And again, this is, I think, that particular bullet point is where we are at, where we seem to be focused on, whereas we should, which goes against what we're looking at, which is a more inclusive education system. The incorporation of life and development skills, peer support, individualized support measures to facilitate the holistic needs of students with disabilities. Again, very important point. And I think a lot of room for how we think about abilities within our society. My cousin, we're the same age, she grew up in Austin, Texas. She was born with a severe learning disability. So, so she's 32 years old, but developmentally, she is at about between 11, like around that 11 to 13 age group, all right? She was able, in Austin, to go to middle school, go to junior high, go to high school, right? The same high school, the same middle school, the same junior high. But they were aware of her condition, And so, you know, in Trinidad, we have this concept of being held back, right? You're being post-primary, and there's a lot of stigma attached to it, a lot of ridicule by your peer group. But what they've managed to do in that system is sensitize students, and that so while she did not progress in the same manner, so you weren't just funneled through the system, she was able to participate and be part of the group and be part of the education system and take part in extracurricular activities, because the programs that they were implementing and the manner in which they implemented it were geared towards, specifically towards inclusion. And I saw that happen, and then I reflected on our school system here. And what would have happened to my cousin had she been born in Trinidad instead of the United States, instead of Austin, Texas? What would have been her lived experience? Are we really going to say, and if we are honest about what is happening in Trinidad and Tobago, are we really going to say it's about the same, should be included in the system? You could go to any school you want, right? You could pick your school. I mean, the minister took great umbrage to whether or not your right is to pick a school. You're missing the point totally. Completely and totally missing the point that Senator Richards was trying to make. When you look at the education system, are we as a parliament, are we as a nation honestly saying that my cousin would have had the exact same experience, or at least felt included in our school system? Never happened. Not in the system as it is designed now. There is no way. As a matter of fact, in my primary school, right, they organized, and I don't know that they still do it. I hope that it's still not done. But it was organized in such a way that there was an A class, a B class, and a C class. Literally what the classes were called, right? As in students who got A's, students who got B's, and students who got C's. The attention paid to the A class students, vastly different from the, and we were told, you are the A class students, you cannot go and spend recess liming with them, right? I mean, going nowhere, what all you're doing. That is the system. You never, it's real, it is real. And I mean, even when you think about secondary school, in secondary schools, you group together scholarship students. You say, all right, these are the people most likely to win scholarships, therefore these are the people most deserving of attention. That is what you get, that is our school system and our cultural understanding of learning as it stands. Again, if you take a very honest reflection of our system as it is today. And the only way it can be fixed, and I'm not saying that is a education system problem. That's more than likely a cultural problem and our understanding of how we group ourselves in society. But again, it requires honesty, it requires discourse, and that is the only way you can change it, but not by sweeping it under the carpet and pretending it does not exist. So if that is the system for students with varying learning abilities on, for want of a better term, the normal spectrum in terms of a medical understanding of it, right? Or yes, in typicals, and on that end of the spectrum, are we again then saying that this very same system is designed to be inclusive of students with special needs? That this system that could separate students based on what is your chance of achievement, our own understanding of what achievement means within the school system, that this system is designed to be inclusive of students with varying learning disabilities. Again, that cannot be an honest response to what Senator Richards is asking. The national policy goes on to talk about the provision of adequate and appropriate professional support staff, assessment services, use of individualized educational plans for all students with disabilities at primary and secondary level. Now, again, the individualized educational plans was not mentioned by the minister. I'm assuming right now it's not being done. And I can safely assume that because there was no discussion of assessment. So if there's no assessment, there's no individualized educational plans. Half of these things are just pie in the sky because we didn't start with the basics of assessing students. Right? Ensuring the recruitment and process for employment. Ensuring the recruitment and process for employment in education is fair and provides for opportunities for persons with disabilities to become educators and administrators. That point was important to me because we, again in the UNC, speak constantly about being more inclusive in decision-making spaces. And inclusivity and diversity in decision-making spaces are important because then you get a varied amount of ideas. Persons would bring their lived experiences to the table. And therefore, by ensuring that the recruitment process for educators for employment in education is fair and allows for opportunities for persons with disabilities to become educators and administrators, then that helps with our understanding of the needs of persons who fall on that end of the spectrum. You see, because it's different for me to say, looking on, that this is what is needed. I have my own ideas. They are from my experiences. They're from the things that I would have read, from the research that I would have studied. But someone who has lived with dyslexia, lived with ADHD, lived throughout the system, gone through the system with these kinds of challenges, would have a different perspective, a unique perspective, and more insight. And therefore, again, I thought this would have been a useful thing for the Minister of Education to highlight and tell us where they are at specifically. No word on that. Again, I assume it's not being done. Provision of accessible vocational training of the same standard as delivered to other students. Again, talking about inclusivity and looking specifically at vocational training. And I go back to my cousin who lives in Austin, Texas. What they did is understanding that most students with her particular learning challenges would not go on to tertiary education, etc. They equipped most of them with specific skill sets that would allow them to live and live as normal a life as possible. And so my cousin was placed as a cashier in Goodwill. So she had that experience of being able to go to work and have a job, and it was a supervised system. And so you weren't just letting people, leaving people to fend for themselves. But the system allowed for dignity and that you were not felt, and the policy speaks to it, The policy speaks to not treating people with disabilities as charity cases, etc., but giving them a space for dignity and to earn, and all of these things can be done in Trinidad and Tobago. But I'll say it again, it requires...
Senator, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. An honest assessment of where we are at. So as I have 5 more minutes, I want to look at the action plan, again, by their same policy. Because the government is really good at writing things down and announcing things and saying you'll do things. Not so good at implementing, not so good at actually achieving anything. So I'll look at what they listed as their short-term plans. Short-term plans from 2018, I assume, means it will be implemented by the end of this year. Somebody on that side can clarify, right? The incorporation of life and developmental skills, peer support, individualized support measures at all levels of the education system. Mr. Vice President, I cannot fathom how they intend to do this. The minister didn't give us any clarification, but given the system as we have it, given the complaints of teachers as it stands, given how we think about education in Trinidad and Tobago right now, the incorporation of life and developmental skills, peer support, individualized support measures at all levels of the education system is listed as a short-term measure. I hope at some point the ministry can tell us where they're at with the implementation of this for students with special needs and for students in general, because I think that's a good plan. It's supposed to be it's supposed to be done in the short term. I have my doubts. Right? The provision, the allocation of appropriate resources for physical and informational accessibility, funding and delivery of inclusive education, the nexus of Senator Richards' motion is listed as short-term on the action plan, which I highlighted and assumed the minister was going to say, this is what we're doing, this is how much we've done, and this is where we're at. Nothing. So going through the action plan, I would not bother to get to the medium term because what was achieved in the short term is nothing, so therefore the medium term seems to be in the distant future. But Mr. Vice President, having gone through all of that, the reason I listed what our plans were for looking, because that promise as listed by the political leader of the United National Congress in terms of assessing students for your learning abilities and looking at making this education system work for all students and the creation of better citizens was so important to me because as I stand here, I am aware that I am representing a political organization that has always put education as a fundamental pillar of development, and not just in theory, but in practice. And given that, Mr. Vice President, the United National Congress, again, wishes to commend Senator Richards on the motion, but also say that we understand the problem and we intend to walk the talk. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Seepersad.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for the opportunity to contribute to the debate on motions calling on the government to commit to providing adequate funding, reforming legislation, and revising policies to ensure that children with special needs are provided with equal opportunities as other students, and that the Ministry of Education immediately initiate and implement a comprehensive strategy to assist all children with disabilities, additional learning needs, and/or challenging behaviors. Mr. Vice President, I've been associated with the Dyslexia Association for the past 25 years, and my contribution to the debate will therefore focus on children who are afflicted with dyslexia. However, the methods and principles employed are applicable to other disabilities and learning needs. In passing, I would like to endorse the need for a comprehensive approach for the education system to consider, not only for specialty learning centers, but for all schools. Slow learners and other differently abled children should not be stigmatized and placed in the slow section of the class. If we consider world-class learning systems, we should benchmark our schools to countries with world-class education systems like Finland, Canada, and Singapore. Our education system, as it now stands, does not prepare any of our children, those with special needs or otherwise, for a digital world. Mr. Vice President, dyslexia should not be a disabling condition. If dyslexic children receive an education that meets their needs, they will grow into fully literate adults. I can personally attest to this. Therefore, the challenge is to provide these educational opportunities while students are in primary school, therefore ensuring inclusion in a literate world. Every month, the Dyslexia Association receives around 30 requests from parents for assessment and tutoring of their children who are failing to acquire literary skills. The Dyslexia Association is a small volunteer-run group and cannot hope to meet the needs of all dyslexic students in the public and private schools. The government must do its part. At this time, there are 3 ways for parents to have their children assessed. Privately at a cost of about $6,000 to $8,000, through the Student Support Services of the Ministry of Education. This is a referral process through the school system, but most parents seem to be unaware of the facility. In other words, even though their child has continued to fail to learn to read, and this happens over many years, they have not been referred to for assessment through the SSS. If referred, a long waiting period is reported. In fact, principals report that students often finish the primary school system and have not been assessed. The third method is teacher-based screening by teachers trained by the Dyslexia Association. But because of financial concerns, teachers often conduct the screening test on a pro bono basis. This is just a screening measure and cannot be used as a diagnosis of a learning disability. Mr. Vice President, while there are no official figures for the incidence of dyslexia in Trinidad and Tobago, internationally recognized figures are that between 15 to 20% of any population will have a reading delay and other literacy challenges. This extrapolates to 150 to 200,000 people in Trinidad and Tobago, or around 6 to 7 students in each classroom, and about 50 to 70 students in a school of 350 students who need reading support using special methods for teaching literacy, not just extra lessons. Additionally, a prerequisite for literacy acquisition, phonological awareness, is compromised by poverty, as in many disadvantaged homes, there's a paucity of language stimulation. This is the probable underlying reason for the high incidence of reading failure among students from disadvantaged areas. A quick look at young people in the prisons show a preponderance of young men and women with poor literary skills. Because of a lack of awareness and possibly a tendency to blame the child for lack of effort or the parents for lack of support, teachers are often unaware of why these seemingly competent children are not learning to read. Parents also blame the children for a lack of effort and often do not seek help until the trauma of the SEA looms. These students are being tutored by dyslexia-trained students are only the tip of the iceberg. Those who are not helped plunge into a spiral of failure and oftentimes end up in a life of crime. Many dyslexics spend long hours having extra lessons where they are not taught by the same methods, that have failed in the classroom. While these methods may be acceptable for most students, dyslexic students need more targeted help if they are to succeed in school. There are also the attending problems of language processing, speech, handwriting, understanding arithmetic, and attention difficulties. The children do not see letters and numbers the way people who don't have dyslexia see it. And the fact that dyslexia often co-occurs with other learning difficulties. Therefore, a range of therapies are required, the cost of which few parents can manage. The association has been training teachers in specific methods for teaching dyslexic children since 1990. There are about 600 teachers in the public and private schools having received this training. These teachers are spread all over Trinidad and Tobago. And we put parents in touch with these teachers so the children can receive tutoring that they desperately need. There's a bursary fund as well, but this is not enough. This is really not enough. There's more that can be done. Mr. Vice President, I have some suggestions for providing education that meets the needs of students with learning disabilities to ensure inclusion. 1, increase the number of educational school psychologists in the student support services so that there are at least 2 in each district. 2, regularize and publicize the requirements for applying for concessions for SEA and other examinations, ensuring that children from families who cannot afford to pay for private assessments are not penalized. 3, So as not to penalize low-income families who cannot afford expensive private sector assessments, the Ministry of Education needs to accept assessments from recognized NGOs such as the Dyslexia Association. 4, place greater emphasis on oral work, language stimulation, phonological awareness, and pre-reading skills in preschool and infant 1 and 2. Failing readers have poor awareness of the sequence of sounds of words. And there are over 86 teachers trained in this program in the primary schools and student support services. These teachers should be used as remedial teachers or be allowed to use the program as a whole class intervention in schools where there is a great number of failing students. 5, structure teaching of all elements of reading from infant 1 to standard 3. These elements include, but are not limited to, phonological awareness and all representations of phonics of the English language. The Ministry of Education should also revisit the use of Jolly Phonics. 6, provision of a teacher trained in specific methods for teaching failing readers in every primary school. Students should remain in their classrooms for most subjects and be given 2 to 3 hours per week of specialist literary tutoring during the school day. 2 excellent models are St. Andrew's School in Maraval and 5th Company Baptist School in Moruga. 7, the Ministry of Education should use teachers trained by the Dyslexic Association as resource teachers in specialist resource rooms. Classroom teachers should also be trained in ways to support dyslexic in the classroom. 8, provision of specialist schools in each region.
Senator, might I ask just how long you think you have again?
Maybe 3 or 4 minutes.
Okay.
Provision of specialist schools in each region based on Ishi's Learning Center model for students who have reading delays of more than 2 years. Schools seems largely unaware of the student support services and the provision of educational assessments. This needs to be recognized so that when schools refer to students, there isn't an inordinate delay in getting onto the waiting list so that they can get assessed. Increase the number of educational psychologists so that there are at least 2 per districts. The Ministry of Health needs to ensure that there are speech therapists available to the public in every district in both Trinidad and Tobago. 12, the Ministry of Health needs to source pediatric occupational therapists for therapy for students with gross and fine motor delays. They probably need about 2 therapists per district. Mr. Vice President, these are all relatively inexpensive and easily implemented solutions which will remove the barrier of illiteracy and which will ensure the success of thousands of failing students in our schools. Many disabling conditions are preventable with early intervention. Literacy failure is certainly not one of them. In closing, Mr. Vice President, I would like to pay tribute to Ms. Stephanie Sherland, the principal of Bishop Anstey High School, from 1963 to 1981, who passed away on March 5, 2019. Ms. Sherland was an educator par excellence who positively molded the lives of thousands of women. She taught us to be bold, strong, and courageous, while always being respectful to others. We were encouraged to think freely and be adventurous. She taught us to be feminist. Ms. Sherland, we will always be grateful to you. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Honourable members, I think now is a good time to take the tea break. As such, this House will now stand suspended until 5 past 5.